fashion fans to acid house raves, Manchester's history is built on the very music of its roots. From the early rebellion of the Smiths to the Batch days of Manchester, there is nothing its walls haven't seen. And it isn't just history that makes its northern city so interesting. Today, it is the roots of world-renowned bands such as the 1975, and houses some of the best digging venues in the world, such as Parkline, that takes place annually in Hinton Park. It's such a fascinating backstory, and decided to take a deeper look into its musical past and present.
When remembering Madchester, it is only correct that we delve into the history of its world-renowned hacienda nightclub, otherwise referred to as one of the most remembered superclubs in the world. Becoming famous in the Manchester years of the 1980s and 90s, the hacienda opened in 1982 and, despite considerable and persistent financial troubles, survived until 1997. The club, which now stands as a block of apartments on Whitworth Street, was mainly supported by record sales from the band New Order, who were formerly known as Joy Division, and Tony Wilson's Factory Records that we will look at later on. After the death of Joy Division's lead singer Ian Curtis, no one expected a comeback as successful as the newly branded band New Order, whose recorded sales allowed the hacienda to exist. It appealed to the city's indie bands, which labelled the city Madchester. The club saw some of the most famous bands and performers in history, such as the Smiths, who performed there 3 times in 1989, and Madonna, who showcased her first performance in the UK there in 1984. What allowed the club's popularity to soar was the genre of house music. From 1987, when the club first started showcasing house music from famous DJs such as Mike Pickering, and the club was then full 7 days a week. It was essentially the drug culture surrounding this style of music that allowed the club to peak during the 1980s. Drugs harboured some of the hacienda's highest points, but also some of its lower. The death of a teenager in 1989 due to ecstasy abuse led to inquiries into the security of the club. After briefly shutting it down, it was reopened with stricter security controls. These controls did not fit well with some of the previous clubgoers and drug dealers whose business was being limited. Doormen were then being threatened after refusing entry, and violence was breaking out outside and inside the club. It had been taken over by drug gangs in search of money and power. Not only this, financial issues began to loom over the club. With most attendees paying entry and then taking illegal drugs, alcohol sales were not providing enough income support to the hacienda, which was struggling to survive on profit from record sales alone. With financial issues and rising drug gangs, in 1997 the hacienda was shut down for good. The hacienda was knocked down in 2002 and turned into apartments. However, the club still remains legendary in rave culture. Through 15 years of famous bands, DJs and drug abuse, this club was, and still is, an icon for Manchester, from the 1990s to the present day. Prominent in the 80s and 90s were bands such as Happy Mondays, Oasis, the Stone Roses, Joy Division and a plethora of others. Through looking back at interviews and news articles from this time, I'm going to delve into the cultures and experiences of fans and bands of the period, and then compare them with the cultures that we see today in Manchester. Without the initial Joy Division, New Order and therefore the renowned hacienda would never have occurred, meaning a crucial element of Madchester would never have existed. Joy Division emerged in the 1970s and became the first band in the post-punk movement. In an interview with Peter Hook, co-founder of Joy Division, he talks about how the band changed the face of Manchester, whether you like it or not. The whole indie music emerging with dance music, the fashion, everything. So from this quotation alone, we can begin to explore how the influences of bands, specifically Joy Division, created this collection of people who were able to bond over music taste and fashion sense. With any cultural movement comes fashion, especially when there's music involved. Manchester bands helped to lead the Madchester fashion movement, with the Britpop revolution of the 90s having a huge influence on styles and trends of the time. Madchester was about the club, and the fashion definitely reflects this. The clothes worn at the time, to put it simply, were clothes that could be danced in, taking inspirations from rave culture, much based around the Hacienda nightclub. Manchester fashions were loose, bright, and designed to make a statement. In an interview within the 2015 Sound of the North documentary, Kim Horton tells us about the scenes within the Hacienda.
There probably is twice as many men as there are women, but you don't tend to notice it the same because everyone's dressed brightly, you know what I mean? And I think the great thing is that the podiums that you can climb onto that holds sort of like, say, 10, 12 people, and the stage that holds possibly like 100. And everyone's chanting to each other and everyone's arms are going out to each other in time. Everyone dances in time, everyone moves in time to the music.
So far we've seen the importance and backstory of the Hacienda in remembering Madchester in terms of rise of drug use in this period, along with the impacts that certain bands such as Joy Division / New Order's music had on the fashion at the time, with the opinion of Kim Hook, an ex-raver at the Hacienda. Now, let's look at how different Manchester's music scene is 40 years later. Music in Manchester in the present day has advanced massively since Madchester days. For example, the 1975, a self-labelled post-punk band that were formed in 2002 have a worldwide fan base, yet started their journey in Manchester, and have a very different sound to what we've heard from Joy Division, but are just as, if not more successful in terms of sales. Here is an example of the band's aesthetic to compare to the previous video of Joy Division. In order to bridge this link between Manchester music and present day, we went behind the scenes at Flat Moon's gig, a 5-piece band with members from both Manchester and Leeds, to see what influences they felt encouraged them to start a band, and from then on, finding their own distinguished sound based on this. So I asked Flat Moon a couple of questions, the first being, do you have any musical influences from Manchester? Ewan, the band's drummer, replied with Stone Roses definitely, and went on to talk about how from a young age he has always listened to and idolised Rennie, who is the Stone Roses drummer. Jacob also added that obviously Oasis have to be up there with my influences in terms of music. I then asked the band what influenced them to become a band and start writing music together. Alex responded, the ability to mess around, have a dance and sometimes get paid for it, other than the obvious girls and partying. So it appears that maybe not much has changed in terms of the partying side of being in a band previously seen by the Hacienda. Being influenced massively by the Madchester bands such as Oasis and the Stone Roses, it really does show that 40 years later, the impact of Madchester is still greatly seen today.